My name is Caitlin Walsh, and my thesis title is Volunteer Educators' Perceptions of Mentorship Involvement, Grades 9 to 12 Robotics. The following tables are served as a reference of abbreviations and definitions which are used throughout this presentation. For example, STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. This study serves as an intersection between informal youth mentorship and community development practices for STEM programs. Youth STEM community programs, such as FIRST Robotics, rely on volunteer mentors, who are primarily non-educators with minimal to no pedagogical training. This study chronicled how adult mentors design and maintain socially safe environments for youth programs, such as robotics teams, regardless of a mentor's professional experience in education. As part of the introduction and literature review, I reviewed the most recent census data for volunteerism in Canada and in the United States. Volunteerism ranges from helping a neighbor to rake leaves to formal coaching, such as STEM program mentorship, which is the topic of this research study. More narrowly, volunteerism in technically based STEM programs often sees an overrepresentation of male participants, which is mirrored in professional STEM fields and in post-secondary education and referred to as the leaky pipeline. FIRST is an international nonprofit STEM program who creates annual project-based learning challenges in leagues from kindergarten to grade 12. The FIRST Robotics Competition, or FRC, is the high school league, which teams compete to build 120-pound robots in socially relevant, annually themed challenges. As a FIRST alumna, volunteer, and mentor, I engaged in this research study as an active member of the FIRST community, which supported my investigation and understanding of themes in the study. Teams such as my own, whose robots are pictured on the slide, are also encouraged to volunteer in the community, as well as to engage in professional mentorship in low-stakes, out-of-school environments. Across the literature and in FIRST most recently published mentor data, there's an overrepresentation of Caucasian men who mentor in STEM, which mirrors STEM's leaky pipeline. The literature review identified several strong foundations which influenced the study. Firstly, the field of educational robotics was founded on constructionist environments, which emphasized the importance of socially safe OST programs for student inquiry. Secondly, in general across youth mentorship, as well as more narrowly in STEM youth programs, mentor satisfaction is closely linked to available hands-on mentor training and a mentor's relationship with fellow volunteers or mentees. Thirdly, when building inclusive communities that consider intersectional identities, a mentor's lived experience, in addition to their rate of empathy, are highly influential on the success of mentor-mentee relationships. The literature review identified the following broad gaps. Firstly, several studies called for additional data sources, such as interviews, artifacts, and surveys, which would allow for the triangulation and increased validity of future studies. Secondly, studies called for more research on mentors as participants, rather than STEM OST youth, to identify motivations, approaches, and successes of mentorship. Thirdly, researchers called on future studies to build on existing singular, such as mentors with disabilities, and dual identity, such as Latinx women, to explore multiple identities of mentors' intersectionality. Based on the literature review, the two research questions were identified. Firstly, how have individual participants' mentorship approaches of grades 9 to 12 robotics teams evolved throughout their time as mentors? And secondly, what approaches do mentors use to develop a sense of community, particularly for underrepresented populations who participate in grades 9 to 12 competitive robotics teams? This study's developed conceptual framework includes 3 theoretical frameworks specific to the research in question. The 3 theoretical frameworks within the study were communities of practice, or COP, project-based learning, or PJBL, and constructionist frameworks. The frameworks were adapted into practical approaches, which were used to develop the methodological approach and supported the analysis and synthesis of the study. The schedule of the research study is illustrated on this slide. The overall study began in 2021 and concluded in November of 2023. The research study occurred in 3 major phases: the study's design, data collection, and data analysis phases. Major milestones in the study included interviews and artifact collection, which began after the official FRC season concluded on April 23, 2022. The first conducted interview occurred just 4 days later, on April 27, 2022, so participants had a recent experience with the most recent first season as they were conducting their interviews. This study was designed within the qualitative case study framework, while I explored the research questions using a collective case study methodology. Within the study, each participant represented a case within the bounded context of volunteers who mentored FRC teams in the 2021 to 2022 season. The use of multiple cases aimed to strengthen the validity and trustworthiness of the study, in combination with purposeful sampling to select participants for cross-case analysis, which allowed me to more fully describe multiple perspectives. Cases that illuminated rich data were prioritized to provide an opportunity to identify phenomenon within the context of the case. Participants were recruited via email and by word of mouth at first events in Ontario during the 2021 to 2022 season. Study participation occurred virtually, which reduced associated barriers with in-person recruitment. For example, several participants described scheduling barriers that were influenced by multiple jobs, reliance on public transportation, and other related barriers that were alleviated in the virtual format. A total of 8 FRC mentors were recruited as participants, who all continually consented to participate at multiple phases during the study. There was an average of 6 years of mentorship experience among participants, which ranged from 1 season to 15 seasons of mentorship as an FRC mentor. 5 of the 8 participants identified as first alumni, which first broadly defines as spending at least 1 season as a participant on a first team between kindergarten and grade 12 before your high school graduation. The remaining 3 participants identified 1 each as a teacher, 1 industry professional, and 1 family mentor who had experience as a homeschooling teacher. This study collected 4 types of data, which included pre-study questionnaires, audio-visual recordings, participant observations, and the optional submission of artifacts. During the study, 1 participant chose to create an artifact of mentorship, 3 chose to submit a previously created artifact, and 4 chose to speak only about their mentorship with the use of no artifacts. The analysis phase of the study uses 6-phase thematic analysis approach, which used in vivo and artifact coding methods for diverse mediums. I used in vivo coding to preserve the participants' voice in the themes, as well as to create the rich description of themes required by the case study methodology. During the thematic analysis phase, I developed and refined a thematic map as illustrated. The 2 major themes, illustrated in yellow, directly responded to the study's research questions, with linking subthemes inductively emerging through the data analysis phases. The inductive identification of themes served to prevent my own potential bias from forming during the data analysis phases. The first identified major theme surrounded the discussion of mentorship evolution, which all participants shared information about previous mentor training they had received in the past. As a baseline, all mentors reported having completed first instructional style slide-based training, which reviews broad mentorship terminology and subject-specific FRC language. In addition to the pre-study questionnaire, all participants responded to the interview question, "How did you learn how to mentor?" Alumni participants largely learned to mentor through trial and error over several seasons. Though motivated, alumni mentors like Bryn described the quality of mentorship using phrases like, "I was awful, I shouldn't have mentored," which linked her personal motivation for her team's competitive success, as well as limited exposure to mentor training in a facilitation style to be barriers of her mentorship practice in the first season that she mentored. For the 3 non-alumni participants, like Amelia, mentors learned their practice by closely shadowing veteran mentors through facilitation-based training, where they described their trainers with admiration using phrases like, "She was amazing, she used leading questions," to describe how veteran mentors modeled ideal mentorship practices and expectations on their team. When discussing mentorship evolution, participants who submitted artifacts of their mentorship provided examples of mentor handbooks, essay submissions, and teaching philosophies in a written format. Often, these documents were born of personal experience, with a lack of available training or resources, such as by alumni mentors. Kamal, Bryn, and Amelia all shared in-depth discussions of their individual mentorship growth throughout their interviews, as highlighted in individual cases in this chapter. For one example, Kamal was an alumni mentor who had been mentoring since 2015 when he graduated from high school. Kamal was the only participant to create an artifact of mentorship exclusively in response to the study's interview. Kamal created a journal entry, which he used to identify his personal success as a mentor, as well as to outline his approach to mentorship of diverse student experiences on a team. As a mentor, Kamal served several teams annually, primarily supporting technical projects, such as programming the team's robot. Kamal described his mentorship approach as a tiered, facilitation-based approach, which he broke down into 3 levels of technical experience visualized in the table. For the least experienced students, Kamal would spend more one-on-one facilitation time sharing information, while he provided project-based prompts for more experienced students to push their skills. The second major theme surrounded the discussion of community development, which all mentors shared stories about their personal identity, as well as the identity of students on their team as influential to their mentorship practices. Participants who submitted artifacts of their mentorship provided examples of annotated videos and community workshops, which they used as tools to shape both mentorship practices and team culture. Mentors who had only completed instructional style training and chose not to submit artifacts to the study demonstrated limited engagement with ED&I, and were unable to deeply discuss intersectional identities either themselves or of their mentees. This included the incorrect perception that the only way to support diverse students was to actively recruit similarly diverse mentors to their first teams. Though all participants were motivated to create inclusive teams, only 2 participants described personal extended inquiry and artifact creation associated with ED&I prior to the study. All participants engaged in discussion by responding to the question, which elements of your personal identity influence your mentorship? For one in-depth example, Jace Hammervik was an alumni mentor whose mentorship was deeply influenced by intersectional factors of their identity. Jace Hammervik submitted and discussed a previously created artifact of mentorship in response to the study's interview, which they used to describe major influences of their mentorship approach, such as their gender, socioeconomic status, and both the presence of visible and invisible disabilities. As a mentor, Jace Hammervik had experience with creating community resources and engaging in facilitation-based mentor training sessions with all mentors on their team. After completing facilitation-based training, Jace Hammervik's fellow mentors engaged in probing questions, such as, how can we make this a space for other groups to join? Throughout their interview, Jace Hammervik described authentic equity, diversity, and inclusion engagement synonymously as being proactive and intersectional, rather than being tokenistic and recruiting. As a second in-depth example, Cade responded to the probing question, how has the identity of students on your team influenced your mentorship practice? As a participant, Cade described himself as a Caucasian man who lived and worked as a teacher for the past 20 years in an Indigenous community in Northern Ontario. Despite his formal training as an educator, and like all participants in the study, Cade's mentorship occurred on a voluntary basis, outside of the context of his job. As a non-Indigenous mentor of exclusively Indigenous students, Cade described his community-building approach by acknowledging his personal privilege and responding in a form of allyship, using phrases like, my identity is to be invisible, in an ongoing effort to celebrate Indigenous youth in STEM programs. Cade used a previously created video artifact to guide his interview discussion, where he acknowledged systemic barriers which he had witnessed his students regularly face in order to access STEM programs. These barriers included a lack of Indigenous role models in STEM, as well as at first events, and inconsistent STEM OST offerings for youth in his community, which included inconsistent funding and available resources that impact the implementation of STEM programs. Discussing the study's first major theme of mentorship evolution, the opportunity for project-based learning phases as a guide for facilitating discussion allowed participants to redirect presentations more clearly during interviews. While all participants engaged in 3 of the 5 project-based learning phases, phases 1, 2, and 5, where they asked meaningful questions, planned investigation, and reflected on learning, the mentors who elected to submit artifacts during their interviews also engaged with phases 3 and 4, in which they gathered information and presented findings. The presentation of those 2 phases deepened the descriptions of mentorship and community development in comparison to mentors who chose not to submit artifacts of mentorship. Further to the discussion of the study's first theme of mentorship evolution, mentors agreed with the constructionist approach of developing a socially safe educational environment. For example, shared sentiments such as Megan's thought that robotics should be a social space, touch on numerous communities of practice and constructionist studies. While First's communities of practice share similar community members, the differences of practices and domains visualized by the 3 yellow circles result in a practitioner's legitimate peripheral participation to vary. For one example, on an FRC team, which is visualized by the smallest yellow circle, participants referred to challenges such as the training of new mentors and the choice to facilitate versus to instruct students when building a robot. For other programs, such as the FRC program level and the FIRST program, examples of legitimate peripheral participation are varied and demonstrated by participants by the use of technical language unique to the FIRST program. While these challenges are shared in formal pedagogy, as visualized by the blue circle, mentors in the study did not use technical pedagogical language and thereby did not demonstrate legitimate peripheral participation when describing their practice. Discussing the study's second major theme of community development, participants who demonstrated high degrees of empathy were able to more deeply define authentic practices associated with community development. Mentorship practices were influenced by both personal and by students' identities. As participants learned more about equity, diversity, and inclusion through personal experience, they were able to reflect on inauthentic community-building practices, such as tokenistic mentor recruitment, which were influenced by a lack of facilitation-based training resources. This study faced several limitations, which included the study recruitment period primarily occurring online and through channels associated with FIRST events in Ontario. Secondly, the duration of the study may not have allowed for extended inquiry in a project-based learning format, as well as the study's design to allow mentors to optionally select to speak about artifacts of mentorship. And thirdly, as constructionist research aims to illuminate the varied subjective understandings with which individuals build from their experiences, the study is not intended to be generalized. Recommendations for future research include continued investigations into the extended inquiry process and project-based learning phases for mentorship training, as well as the investigation of facilitation-based mentor training programs, especially when compared to instructional, slide-based training. In conclusion, the study identified that project-based learning phases provide a positive framework for communication of volunteer educators to self-reflect deeply on their mentorship practices. Secondly, participants described the construction of communities of practice at the FRC team level, which emphasized that robotics should be a social space rather than focusing on competitive success. And thirdly, participants who had experienced facilitation-based training were more likely to exhibit authentic community development approaches, which begin to address STEM's leaky pipeline.